Good evening. It's been a long day, but a very fruitful day. Lots of wonderful conversations. I'm glad to see everyone here. I'm here to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed, who is a Carl M. Loeb University professor at Harvard University. Dr. Gordon-Reed is the MacArthur Genius and the first Black person to win the Pulitzer Prize for History, one of the integral voices who brought Juneteenth into national conversation. Her New York Times best-selling book about this profound day, On Juneteenth, is a powerful, essential work of history that weaves together America's past with personal memoir. It was named one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post, by Time, and NPR. The New York Times calls Dr. Gordon-Reed one of the most important American historians of our time. She first rose to prominence when she pushed for scholars and the public to take Black people's versions of history seriously, no matter how inconvenient they may be. Today, she draws upon her book to show us how we can learn from the past and we can keep striving for progress together. I want to also add that Dr. Gordon-Reed was one of the first persons to break the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings with her earlier work in the 1990s, and was profound in teaching us how to research our presidential histories. So please welcome Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'd like to say I'm very happy to be here. This is my first time in San Antonio. I grew up in East Texas, and because we didn't have, I was telling people at the table that because we didn't have any family members here, we never visited here. I had relatives who came here and talked about it, but this was not a destination for us. I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to have a chance to spend much time and go around, not to even see the Alamo. But I'll do that the next time I come back, and I'll remember when I do. You know, it's interesting that the title, On Juneteenth and Slavery in Texas, is sort of interesting because it's as though people think about Texas and slavery when slavery's over, that's when it comes into the consciousness of people. I grew up in, as I said, in East Texas, and I knew about slavery because I'm from a Black family, and my family has been in Texas for many generations. While I was working on the book, I was able to trace things back at least into the 1820s on my mother's side, and my father's side, the 1850s. And so my family has been in Texas for a very, very long time. And we didn't leave Texas, actually. I mean, I'm unusual in having left Texas. Many Black people that I know in the North, where I live now, are descendants of people who left the South and to escape everything. And my family didn't do that. My family pretty much stayed in Texas. If they moved anywhere, they moved from a farm into Houston or moved into Dallas, but not off anywhere. So all of my family is pretty much here. I don't have family and relatives spread around the country. So I felt that if I wanted to write a book about Texas and to talk about it, that I would have a basis for doing that because of my family history. It was not something that I really wanted to do. My editor, Bob Weil, had suggested that I do a big book about Texas, a big book about Texas slavery, and sort of like the Hemingses of Monticello, but in Texas, with my family as the basis of the story. And I'd resisted that. And I got the idea after doing an essay for The New Yorker about celebrating Juneteenth as a child. and what that meant, and how my great-grandmother, who lived until I was about 10 years old, would talk to me about how important the day was. And she always had this feeling that people were not taking it seriously enough. That the younger generation, this is something that happens to older people always, the young people are not doing what they're supposed to do. But she thought, and she was probably right, because we thought of it as a day, as kids, we thought of it as a day for barbecue and red soda water and throwing firecrackers, things that I can't imagine allowing my children to do. My grandfather actually bought us firecrackers during that time period. So it was a fun thing, but we hadn't connected to the institution of slavery. And she said it was not just another day for her and her mother, who had been born a slave and was freed as a child by a man who was her father, actually. Nevertheless, took this very, very seriously, always took it very, very seriously, and wanted to impart that with us. To us. Now, I knew that slavery was in Texas, as I said, but I will admit it wasn't something that was talked about very much in school when I was growing up. It was sort of mentioned in an uncomfortable kind of way, and we were more likely to talk about slavery other places than Texas. Juneteenth, as I said, came around every year, and you commemorated or thought about the end of slavery, but we didn't talk about the actual institution very, very much. And I think the country has that attitude as well. As I've grown and moved away from here, I get the impression that people think about Texas, when they think about Texas, they think about it as the West, the sort of Western tradition of Texas. Cowboys. Now, we know from your exhibit here that there are black cowboys. The cowboys are not all white, but in the Hollywood portrayal of it, on television and so forth, this was the quintessential white kind of thing, so much so that when we had Go Western Day, where you were supposed to wear Western clothing, there was some ambivalence about it. Black people were questioning, should we do this? Does this have anything to do with us? When, of course, as you're telling us here, it does have very much to do with us. And the idea of Texas as a cowboy place, and I say in my book, Texas as a white man, white and male, is an understanding of what Texas is like. What does that say for people who are not white or people who are not male? There are white women here, there are black women and black men, but this image of Texas as a white male cowboy, or alternatively, oil man, sort of dominates what people think about the state. What's left out of that, of course, is the other type of white man, which would have been a plantation owner. That's not a part of people's consciousness much at all, I think of. When you think of plantations, people think of Tara, or in Georgia, or Mississippi, all of those places, the sort of deep South, but not Texas. And as I'm sure you know, and you may have heard today in the conference talking about slavery, slavery was in Texas very early on, as soon as the first people started coming over here, even before Stephen F. Austin. Slaves and enslaved people were brought into Texas in the 1820s. It was always a controversial thing because, as I'm sure you also know, that Mexico was not with slavery, the idea that they didn't like the idea of slavery, and that was always a conflict. When Stephen F., and I talk about in my book that Stephen F. Austin, who is the father of Texas, called the father of Texas, was very clear about the fact that slavery was an integral part of Texas and was going to be an integral part of Texas from the very, very beginning. And he said in a couple of letters, one letter that I cite, he says that if white people came to Texas without slavery, they could expect to be poor for a very, very long time. They needed enslaved people to cut the forests, to plant the cotton, do the sugar cane, and if they didn't have enslaved people to do that, they would have to do it themselves, and they didn't want that. So this was something that's from the very, very beginning. Now, I don't remember that as a story about Stephen F. Austin when I was a kid, that was a part of it. So that was kept, it's not just that people on the outside of Texas don't think about the institution of slavery in Texas, is that Texans themselves isn't an integral part of our story, the thing that we tell about ourselves. Now, I understand why that is the case. People prefer a heroic vision, their understanding of a heroic vision of history, but that's not really history. That's not the whole story. And if you really want to know why we are where we are today, and who we are today, the problems that we have, they have their genesis in this time period. We are still living with the legacies of slavery. And the chief legacy would be a legacy of white supremacy. The idea that slavery taught white people how they were supposed to view black people, taught black people what their position was supposed to be, and enforced that through centuries of enslavement. The people who settled Texas were from other slave-holding states. The idea was that Texas was going to be a part of the expanding cotton empire. Cotton and that whole notion of a cotton empire was based on the idea that slavery was going to be expansionist. It wasn't going to stay in one place. It would spread, and Texas was the place to which it spread. And so many of the people who came here were some of the most hardcore people, hardcore supporters of slavery. By the time we get to the Civil War, people are pouring into Texas, sending slaves here, coming with their own enslaved people to try to be one step ahead of the Union Army, the Army of the United States, in order to protect the investment in people. So this commitment to the institution formed the basis of the society. And as I said, this is something that we have reverberations of that. People like to think that the good things that happen in history stick with us, but the bad things that happen in history stick with us as well. And this is one of them. So when I was thinking about writing the book on Juneteenth, the idea wasn't to just fixate on that particular day. It was to talk about the lead up to that and the aftermath of it. Juneteenth was the end of something, but it was the beginning of something else. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But in thinking about writing the book, I understood that I was going to be up against this image of Texas that Texans have and that Americans have in general, and also the sense that Texas is sort of an inexplicable place. I mean, one of the things that's happened to me since I've been on the East Coast, I left to go to college as an 18-year-old, and then went to law school in the East, and then moved to New York. So I've been away from Texas many years, and one of the things that I've found myself having to do over the years is to explain Texas. People would say, you know, what's up with Texas? What's going on? I mean, I think Texas and Florida are the places that people want an explanation for. And I thought that in writing the book, that I could talk about Texas in a way that would make it explicable. And I sort of understood, and I thought that what was important was for people to get away from this notion of the cowboy, the cattle rancher, and the oil man, the movie Giant. I'm sure some of the older people people my age and older in this audience would remember the movie Giant that talked about the oil man. The history of Texas is, once upon a time, there were cowboys and cattle ranchers, and then oilmen came and they fought each other, and then they found oil under the land of the cattle ranchers, and then they all became friends. And that's the story of what Texas is, leaving the plantation owner out of that. All of this is a West Texas story, even though I guess Spindletop is in East Texas. But the beginning of it is really East Texas, but you think of West Texas as oil and cattle. So I wanted to say, if you want to understand this place, you have to understand the racial history of it. And to understand the racial history of it, you have to go back and talk about the institution of slavery. So Juneteenth is the end of that part of the story, the beginning of another, but you have to understand how we got to where we are today. So I explain that in the book, and San Antonio features because I do talk about the Alamo, and I understand that that's something of a sore topic. Sore topic may not be the way to describe it, but I have a chapter called Remember the Alamo. I was speaking to someone earlier who was referring, and I brought up a book called Forget the Alamo, which apparently has been very, very controversial, got banned or something like that. Is it still banned? I suppose, probably still banned. My book came out at about the same time. Now, I think I read somewhere that it was banned at one particular place, at some plantation, but they put it back. The funny thing about it is that I have a chapter called Remember the Alamo, and the book is called Forget the Alamo. We say basically the same things. I tell pretty much the same story, the thing that I've been talking to you here now, that slavery was from the beginning. Stephen F. Austin and the impresarios and all those people came with the full expectation that they were going to have slaves. They were sort of eyeing Mexico, that gave them a special dispensation, but never trusted them. They thought that they were eventually going to move against the institution, and so I tell the same story, it's just that I said, remember the Alamo, but I want you to remember the Alamo for a particular reason. Not just for lots of reasons, but I wanted people to remember it because it was a part of the plan, to fight for independence was a fight to preserve the independence to keep the institution of slavery. It wasn't the only thing that the Texians, as they were called, were fighting about, but it was a big part of what they were fighting about, is to keep the institution of slavery. That's what they had come over with enslaved people, their parents. They had the expectation that they were going to have this glorious future, Texas, and then continue on to California, Cuba. They wanted Cuba. It's an expansion, as I said, it was an expansionist notion, and it was never going to be just in one place. That's why they went berserk. When Abraham Lincoln said, when he says, well, if we can preserve slavery where it is, that's fine, but we're not going to have any expansion. And so people say, well, why would the Southerners get upset about that? And the answer is they wanted to expand. Him saying you can preserve it in one space, to them, was the equivalent of saying, I'm going to destroy it. So the Texians thought that this was part of their birthright. And that's one of the things that they were fighting for. And I talk in the book about what did it mean to me as a Texan, a young black Texan, to discover, not in my classes, but from my own reading, that, wait a minute, the Mexicans are supposed to be the bad guys? They're the bad guys. They're the people who, in part, have outlawed slavery, are anti-slavery, and I'm supposed to remember and glorify people who, William Barrett Travis, Jim Bowie, was a slave trader with his brother in New Orleans. Barrett Travis had enslaved people. Not a great guy at all. I mean, in the movie, The Alamo with John Wayne, I talk about this, going to see it when I was in the 4th grade. And Lawrence Harvey is very dashing and handsome as William Barrett Travis, but he wasn't a really good guy. I mean, he ran out on his wife and children, and a lot of people who came to Texas were like one step ahead of the law, and he was one as well. So, it was sort of a disillusioning thing for me as I was older to find out that part of the reason they were fighting was to maintain the institution of slavery, to keep my ancestors, and I mean my actual ancestors, because as I said, they were here. Some of them were here in the 1820s. and the 1830s, when all of this was going on, when there was this tension between Texians and Mexicans that eventually came to a head with the War for Independence. And so how do I take that story? How does a young black person take that story? How are we supposed to admire these people and glorify in all of this, knowing the real history, part of the history of that? Now, maybe we're going to have questions right after this. Maybe you could give me some suggestions about how that could take place, if you thought of it, how to do it. But there's that ambivalence that's there. And even the ambivalence, I think, makes people antsy. The people who want the heroic vision don't like the idea that anybody even pauses to say, well, what about this aspect of it? What about slavery? What does this mean? How do we fit this into this particular narrative? So I explore this in the book because it makes me wonder, what does it mean to be a Texan? How do we have an image of Texas that encompasses the stories of all people? And the book is a way to try to give some suggestions about how you do that, or to be open-ended about it, that history is not just about making yourself feel good about things. It's about telling the truth. And it's about a way of helping you understand the choices that people made in the past, and that we can do things differently. We don't have to repeat the mistakes of our forefathers and foremothers, that there's a different way of going. So remember the Alamo, for me, not to knock the title, forget the Alamo, but remember it for a particular reason, to remember it in its fullness, to remember the entire story, and that it's not just about heroism of a particular kind. The notion of standing for what you believe in is important, but you also have to kind of know what people believe. What is it that what they're standing for, and you can decide that you're going to accept that. The principle of being steadfast we can go along with, but the particular things are problematic here. So talking about that, confronting that when I was working on this book was important for me, because I did grow up with this kind of ambivalence, and I'm wondering, where did I fit? How do I fit in this particular story? Is there some way for my voice and for the interests of my ancestors to matter in this particular narrative? So the Alamo figures in the story. Juneteenth, as I said, as a ending of something and a beginning, is the actual literal end of the book. When I talk about not only the story of Gordon Granger coming in and making the announcement and so forth, but to think about the aftermath of all of this. So this is, when I was a kid, as I said, this was a sort of precursor to, well, sort of a pre-July 4th. It was the Black July 4th for us, and then we would celebrate July 4th as well. And I thought of it as a holiday that belonged to Black Texans. I have to say that at the beginning, I thought it was sort of strange when I saw white people who celebrated it as well, because I wasn't used to it, because it was told to us as a holiday that was specifically about African American freedom and emancipation. It becomes a state holiday in 1980, and then everybody has the license to celebrate it, and I accepted that. That if you're Texan, this is a part of Texas history. By then I was older, and I understood that this was a part of Texas history, and it was a good thing for everybody to celebrate it. And then I began to see people in other parts of the country when I went away to college celebrating it, and I thought, I don't know, what does this have to do with the rest of the country? This is our holiday. And then I matured and understood that this should be celebrated by all people as an advancement in human rights. Everybody can do that. If you want to be an ally and you want to recognize something when society has made progress, when we've made a step forward, then anybody who wants to do that come on down. We could join the fun, and it's a good thing for everybody to celebrate. But the question is, how do you celebrate it, and what does the celebration mean? Is it a way of denying or sort of putting aside uncomfortable questions? Or on that particular day, do you think about all aspects of it? This is not just a day of celebration. In fact, some people have pushed back to me about calling it a celebration, saying, should we say celebrate or commemorate? Because we understand that it was not, as I said, not the end of something, it was the beginning of another kind of struggle. And people don't want to forget what happened afterwards. That, and I talk about this in the book, that there were people who celebrated and people were whipped for celebrating. There was violence. People were continued to be held in bondage. Anywhere the army was not, the people who were still, who had been enslaving people did not want to give up. So it was not just a quick end to something. It was a part of another struggle. So there are people who say, well, I don't know that I really like the idea of celebrating that, given that I know that things didn't change as much as they should have during that time period. I think it's both. You should commemorate it, you should celebrate it, because people were celebrating because they were happy, There is a such thing as a black joy, and they were celebrating the fact that the end of legalized slavery meant that it would not be, at least where the army was, you would not be able to sell people, families away from one another. People would not be legally chattel. Didn't mean they wouldn't be mistreated, but it was something better than had been before. And there was a joyous celebration, and I think that we can recognize that, even though we understand that it was going to be a struggle. So when I was doing the research for the book and finding things to put in, I was very, very moved by a story about 5 black men in Houston who worked to pool their resources to buy land for people to celebrate Juneteenth. And you just think about this. It was in 1875. It was not a great time to be black in Texas in 1875. This was a tough time. And there was still resentment. Well, resentment doesn't even begin to describe the word. Hostility towards the idea of free African American people in Texas. But these men pooled their resources, bought the land to have people to celebrate Juneteenth. And think about that. I mean, the foresight of that, their thought, their belief that their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would want to celebrate. They said, of course they're going to remember this day. Of course they're going to celebrate, and we're going to buy something and make sure that they have a place to do it. And that became Emancipation Park in Houston, which is still there. And I've been to Emancipation Park to celebrate Juneteenth growing up. And it's a testament to the foresight, to the belief, the faith of these people who, in the middle of this terrible time, I mean, Reconstruction is ending at this point. The hope that had been there for a time, the door was closing on that. But they had the faith that they were going to go forward. And so I wanted to tell this story in the book, and I wanted people to think about it because it's a lesson for young people today. I mean, we think that we're living maybe in the worst times, or some people think we're living in the worst times, or very, very bad times, and that could be true. But the people who are our ancestors went through so much more and kept faith so that we could be here. And stories like that, I think, were important to tell because it's a lesson for people to say, no matter what the circumstances are, you can do something that will be meaningful for other generations. And that's how you keep things going forward. You don't despair. and say that there is no hope, because there is hope, and if you take action, you can make that hope in some ways a reality. So that was an uplifting story for me in thinking about Juneteenth and the question of whether or not we should celebrate or commemorate. There should be celebration, there should be commemoration. You should think about the hardships that people suffered from, but also think about the perseverance of people. You know, I found something when I was working on the book that I didn't expect to find, I wasn't looking for, and that's the great thing about history. For historians, I mean, to come upon things that you're least expected, you know, you're going down one road and then you come upon something else that's totally different and it's a total surprise to you. I found my great-great-grandfather's name on a voting list in 1867 in Madison County in Texas. And it was stunning to me, and it was moving to me because, you know, here was a person who'd started his life as a chattel, treated as an item of property. And here he was participating in choosing the representative in a republic, choosing who would represent him in the government. And I felt an enormous sense of pride, but I also felt a tinge of sadness, 1867, because I know it's going to happen. In a few years, the Redeemer governments would come back to Texas, and all of the participation that people had, the black legislators, black people who were prominent figures in then the Republican Party when blacks were Republicans. Galveston was the site of major political activity among blacks, and one of the things that I hope to do is to write more about Galveston, to find out more about Galveston, because it's just a fascinating time period. I found that there were black men who were on the docks who had a union in the 1890s, in the beginning of the 20th century, something, again, that all the things that black people were doing at this time period, you think of it just as, you know, a time of eclipse, that it's awful, and it was, but there were still, just like the people who bought the land in Houston, there were still people who were doing things, whatever they could, however they could push things forward, they were doing it in order to sort of advance African American people. And so, you know, those kinds of things, to find that, and I tell the story of my great-grandfather, who had a cotton farm with my great-grandmother in Moscow, Texas, as we pronounced it. It's spelled Moscow, but we pronounce it Moscow, Texas, deep East Texas. And he used to, after he planted everything, he would go to Galveston to work on the docks because he was able to make money doing that after, you know, being a farmer, but also getting extra money that way. And I don't know that he was in the union, but it opened up a whole world to me of what people were doing at a time when I thought, you know, the world was totally closed. It was more than just church. I mean, church was obviously a big part of this, but they were doing all kinds of things as ways to try to advance themselves. So Juneteenth, 1865, ended the legal institution of slavery in Texas. But it opened another struggle, the struggle against white supremacy, a struggle that we are still facing today. The notion of a racial hierarchy that was, as I suggested, was put in place by the institution of slavery, hardened and solidified during the institution of slavery. And so ending the book talking about Juneteenth as the beginning of a struggle that we're still in is a way of making a connection from the past to the present. Juneteenth is a day to celebrate, but it's also a day to think about the institution of slavery and how it has shaped all of us. And I connect this to another chapter in the book talking about my decision, or not my decision, what am I talking about? It was my parents' decision to send me to a white school when I was 6 years old to integrate the schools in our town. That, to my mind, is connected, is a part of that struggle that started in 1865, because we were still, at that point, dealing with the racial hierarchy that was put in place to substitute for slavery after the end, after the end of slavery. And this is 1965, it's 100 years after that, and my parents decided to, as I said, to send me to a white school. There was a freedom of choice plan that was designed to circumvent Brown versus Board of Education. And the idea was that white parents would pick white schools, and black parents would pick black schools, and my parents decided to pick a white school, to send me to Anderson Elementary School, and not back to Booker T. Washington, the inevitably named Booker T. Washington School for Blacks. And that set me on a journey, made the connection to this whole march of progress that it took 100 years to get to. And it shaped my life in ways. It made me think about race. It made me think about history. It made me think about law in a particular kind of way that I don't think I would have if I had not had that experience. But I saw myself, I never didn't think of it until I was actually working on the book, think of it in these terms, as a connection to my grandparents and my great-grandparents who saw themselves as people who were trying to move the ball along. And my parents made this decision, in some ways an amazing decision. I actually think about, I've often thought about whether or not I would do that with my kids today. Not today, but when they were 6 years old. And I'd have to say no. I don't know that I would. And I think the reason is that my kids were 6 years old, but in the 90s. And nothing was going on in the 90s, really, much. Grunge, maybe, whatever, musical styles. But when I was that age, we were in the 60s. And it was the civil rights movement. It was the height of the civil rights movement. I was working on this book, and I'm thinking, why did my parents do this? I mean, I asked them, and they gave me different reasons. The reasons changed over the years, which is another thing for historians, a lesson for historians. People think that, there's one answer to something, but as people get to be older, and then they look, why did I do that? Oh, it was really because of this, because of that. But I think it was because they were in the middle of a civil rights movement, and they were not alone. See, when I'm thinking about my kids in the 90s, there's no movement, there's nothing taking place that I would have felt a part of. I think they had the courage to do it because they saw themselves as pioneers, that they were, in fact, just like the people in the 1860s who were going forth, signing up to trying to become, voters, buying land for purposes. They saw themselves as advancing the ball. And the way to do that was to have their child integrate the school. And they didn't feel, as I said, as if they were by themselves. They were part of a movement. And I wouldn't have been a part of a movement because there wasn't a movement there, but during the 1990s. But even though they changed their attitudes, changed their story about why they did it, once they became a bit disillusioned, I should confess, about integration. Looking back at it, I think it really was idealism on their part. They had grown up in Texas. Their lives had been blighted by segregation. My mother had gone away to college in Atlanta at Spelman, and even though she left one part of the South, she went to another part of the South that was similarly restricted in lots of ways. And I think they saw themselves as pioneers and wanting to move things forward. So they're differing parts of the book that come back to the basic notion that black people have been on a journey from the very beginning. And we're on a journey now. And the connections that we have to one another are forged by the experiences that our ancestors had. And certainly the institution of slavery and the creation of a racial hierarchy have informed the way we think we're supposed to maneuver in the world. And that has certainly been, my experience. I think I became a historian, I became a lawyer, probably because I integrated the schools as a 6-year-old. I didn't have a well-developed sense of it, but I understood that history mattered. Why was it a big deal that I was going to school with white kids? I had to think about, where did this come from? And also, I had some sense that lawyers were involved in all of this. I knew that there had been legal cases about it. So that experience helped shape my understanding of what it was that I wanted to do in the world. And after I finished the book, I was cleaning up my apartment and going through the closets. I found an essay that I had written about integrating the schools in my hometown, maybe 15 years ago, that I'd forgotten I'd written it. And it was interesting to read what I wrote 15 years before I wrote this chapter. And it's pretty much the same. I mean, my responses were, pretty much the same to it. But what it means is this is something that's been on my mind for a very, very long time, and has been, just to help shape the core of who I am. And I finally got an opportunity to put it down and to publish it. I have sort of hidden for most of my career behind the stories of other people's families, writing about the Hemmingses, writing about Jeffersons, the Randolphs, all of those people, and finally confronting my own family history, which is difficult to do. It's not something I've wanted to do very much. I never thought that I was going to write a memoir. And people ask me, is this something that I want to do again? I'd say probably not. But it was useful, I think, as a way of talking about this state. It was a comfortable way for me to approach being a Texan, dealing with the fact that I grew up in a place that I loved, but in many ways did not love me. Thinking about how do you handle that? And I say in the book that I still love Texas, but I love Texas because of the people that I knew here, because of my family, my mother and my father and my brothers and my grandparents. The experiences we had on this particular land, in this particular place, are mine, and it makes the place mine, even though there are a lot of people who don't think it's mine and who treated me as though it is not mine, it doesn't belong to me. And the question is, who wins in all of that? I mean, it looks like others are winning at the moment, but it's a battle. And I never thought that I should give up a place where I learned to love people and people loved me because other people did not choose or do not choose to see me as a human being. That's their problem. It's not my problem. And I think I want to keep fighting for it. I don't live here, but I write about it, and I'll write more about it. I might not be writing about myself in this. I might do that book about, the big book that my editor wanted me to do about slavery in Texas. But it's not a battle that I think we should give up, because it's a battle for humanity. That's what Juneteenth, as I said, you let everybody who wants to celebrate and advance in human rights should do it, because this is our opportunity to make clear that humanity, that this place it belongs to all people, not to just one group of people. And that means that you have to tell the story as truthfully, as broadly, as, well, as openly as possible in order to make sure that we all understand how we got to where we are. And we all belong here. Our children belong here because we're human beings. And no one should be able to take that away. And so in essence, that's what Juneteenth means to me. I think that there are a lot of people who've, I've had some criticism from people from other states who say, no, wait a minute. Why is it that we have a federal holiday that's about Juneteenth? There were emancipation days in other states. Emancipation was not just one thing, it was a process. As the Army of the United States moved across the land, as enslaved people themselves left the plantations, voted with their feet, and actually emancipated themselves. So why should it be Texas? And I said, well, because Texans are chauvinistic. And if we celebrate the holiday, it should be a federal holiday. And that's really what it is, just the bravado of Texans. I mean, I suppose it could have been, I guess, in Virginia, they do April. In San Agustin in Florida, they do another day, and whatever. It's just that we agitated, or we, Miss Opal Lee, agitated and made it a federal holiday because it's Texans, and why not, is my attitude. But I'm very glad that it happened. I was very fortunate to be able to go down to Washington for the signing of the bill. I got an email at like 8 o'clock in the morning saying, do you want to come down to Washington and witness the signing of this? And so I was at 11 o'clock on the shuttle down to DC, and Opal Lee was there, Miss Opal was there, and Cornyn was there, I think. Yeah, he was there, and there were, and there were just Cornyn, and other Texas politicians, and everybody was happy because it was a Texan thing. So it was a good day. It's a day, I think, that it's an opportunity, I hope, that people use for education. It's a holiday that is built for history, that's built for learning. And, it doesn't get rid of inequality. It doesn't get voting rights and so forth. But it is a day for us to reflect on an important moment, an important principle about the humanity of all mankind. So with that, I would like to take your questions. Oh, does somebody have a microphone? No, somebody must have a question. Oh, right there. Well, a couple of people.
First of all, I just want to thank you so much. As an educator, reading your work on like Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, you were saying what I wanted to say, but didn't yet have the language to say. So I wanted to ask you, how do you deal with like shifting the traditional narratives as a historian? How do you deal with the pushback that you receive or don't? Mm-hmm. But when you're shifting the traditional narrative from what has been upheld?
Well, it's the Hemings thing was something different because there'd been a long period of denial on the part of Jefferson scholars. I mean, African-American people, I think my grandmother told me, Thomas Jefferson had Negro children. That was something that was an article of faith among, I think, African-American people, because this kind of thing happened all the time. I mean, why would that be a big deal? But I think I was helped along because my book came out in 1997, and I said that Madison Hemings was likely telling the truth when he said Jefferson was his father, and that the story that Jefferson's grandchildren told about why Sally Hemings' children looked just like Jefferson, that they were the children of his nephew, that story was not likely true. And I had a boost because the DNA testing that they did the following year corroborated what I said. So I had a moment of pushback, a real serious pushback when the book came out, but I was helped by the DNA. Now, there were still people who said, well, you know, it could be the brother, it could be something, and who tried to come up with another story about this. I felt that I was right because my first book was really not just about whether or not Jefferson and Hemings had children together. It was about the way white historians were writing about enslaved people's words. That's really what it was. It said, you know, you may not believe the story is true, but for you to say there's no evidence, as if what they said, as if they'd never said anything, they never talked. It's how do you not listen to people who were the victims of slavery, who were clearly victims? You know, we typically pay attention to what victims say. And here it was like, no, we have to protect their victimizers, really. And Jefferson knew he was victimizing people. He said that. He knew better than that. So that was the principle. And so I was so sure that I was right about that I really didn't pay any attention to people who, you know, sometimes you know if you're right, if you really believe you're right about something. And again, not Tom and Sally, but I know you are writing in a way that ignores the evidence, ignores the words of African American people. And there's not just wrong, but it's immoral. I mean, slavery is a moral question. And for historians to take the part of the people who are the wrongdoers, it just infuriated me. So I was so infuriated by that I really didn't pay any attention to the pushback. And then I got help with the DNA. But Juneteenth is different because I think Juneteenth is kind of a feel-good thing for people. It's only when you begin to sort of look behind it and you talk about, as I do in the book, about the violence that was meted out, then it becomes problematic, or the Alamo, the other things about Texas and the Republic of Texas, you know, that was explicitly founded, you know, in the Constitution. It supports slavery, and it says black people can't be citizens. It said, I mean, how can you talk about Texas history? How can you talk about the Republic of Texas without mentioning that? It's in the Constitution. So those things, you know, I think they're sort of different in the way that they've been handled. This is now, people are being forced to look at something that they've kind of looked away from. You know, as I mentioned, you know, not talking about slavery very much as a student growing up. They may do better now. I'm sure they do better now, right? In schools in Texas. They're trying. Well, you said everything is in reverse, but there must have been a period of time when things were better, which caused a backlash, right? No? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, all right. So I do know that I get the sense that there are teachers who are trying to do better, but there's pushback on the part of people. So yeah, this is gonna be an interesting time. And not just in Texas, but all over, I mean, Florida, all over. People are, I mean, history is political. You know, and people want to control the narrative about it. I just don't understand, however, why there can't be a story of good and bad, why it has to all be, you know, cloudless glory. It was all wonderful, and the way some people think. But that's because I'm a historian, and I don't. If you love history, you love the complexity of it. if you want to just use it for purposes, then you wouldn't feel that way. So.
Coming over.
You're coming.
Have you ever been to Comanche Crossing in Limestone County, Groesbeck?
No.
There's a major Juneteenth celebration there every year that takes place on a private park that was established by freedmen in the 1870s. And it was there that a gubernatorial candidate in Texas in 1978 gave a speech advocating for Juneteenth holiday, which was picked up by other politicians, which we found to be a significant milestone when it took place. But Comanche Crossing, you're from Polk County, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, not too far away.
Not too far. I've heard of it, but I've not been. That's another thing. I'd like to travel more through Texas. And you go, woo? It's kind of scary. Is that the prospect of it?
Oh, again, I also say that one of the reasons that I think Juneteenth has been shared and embraced by others nationally is not just because we're chauvinistic Texans, but it was the last of those liberation events in the country, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, people...
So it was 2.5 years later.
Because people ask me, well, why not celebrate the end, the formal end, the legal end of slavery in December 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment? And I said, but no, the thing about Juneteenth is was the last... the Confederate Army kept fighting here in Texas. I mean, the last battle was here in Texas.
Right.
So really what this is the end of the military effort to maintain the institution of slavery, and that's important.
And
I mean, law is important, but it took a war it took something outside of law it was really the war that ended slavery, not just I'm not saying the 13th Amendment isn't important, but it was a war that took it. And so I think it's important to commemorate that. And it was the last moment when there was an organized military effort to maintain the institution of slavery, and that was defeated at the beginning of June when they surrendered. And then, that's when Granger is able to come in and make the announcement. So it is important.
Worthy of a national celebration.
Mm-hmm.
Where I wanted to go was because this young lady actually sent me in a direction I did not want to go. She was talking about President Thomas Jefferson. I was going to talk to you about Custer, but since you mentioned Thomas Jefferson, my question is going to be twofold. The first part of that is, we talked about the Hemings-Jefferson issue. Are you aware of J.A. Rogers' book on the 5 Negro presidents? No one seems to want to address the fact that Jefferson himself was a mulatto, which I find fascinating. They want to talk about Hemings, but he himself was compromised in that regard. Since we got to talking about Gary's point about the Juneteenth and then, of course, the ratification, you were absolutely on firm ground that the war was not over even when the ratification. And so my question was, are you aware of Custer's involvement in Juneteenth?
No.
Okay, so General George Armstrong Custer is ordered by Lincoln to appear in New Orleans, and then Sheridan sends him up to northern Louisiana to get further forces because the Confederacy is still fighting in the tri-state area of Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. And so he is billeted in Waller County at the Leno Plantation. Our family is from Waller County. So the reason why we know it because our family business was blacksmithing, and my sister and my great-grandfather was the first treasurer of Waller County, a black man in 1873. But prior to that, before Waller County was created in 1873, it is southern Grimes County, which is now where Hempstead was located. It just changed counties, but it was there. And so Custer is billeted there in southern Grimes County. And he is responsible because Lincoln says you cannot go down to support Granger, but send troops out of Waller County. It's important for us to know there was no way a ship of that day or this day would have the capacity for 4,500 troops. So those troops were brought out of New Orleans up to the tri-state area fighting, and some
And
of
then
them-
brought down.
and then brought down, and then they were force marched to support Granger's proclamation in Galveston. Nobody asked the question as to why the proclamation is made in Galveston, because Galveston's not the capital of Texas. Austin is the capital. And you were on target because Barrett Travis and Crockett and all those guys, they were all slave smugglers. So they made the proclamation where the crime was being committed.
Yeah.
And so Custer was not able to attend because his presence would have disrupted and gotten those Confederate generals irritated. So he had to sit while the troops were billeted out and in forced march to Galveston.
Custer, who got his comeuppance at the end, a little bighorn.
The deal on that is he wanted to take the 9th and the 10th Cavalry with him, but they were told to stand down and stay at Fort Clark, Fort Davis, Fort Concho, because they had fought with him during the Civil War. The reason why Custer was sent to the Dakotas, because he was an excellent tactician, but he was savage about his personal conduct. He was consorting with the wives of his superiors and his inferiors. He was a ladies' man. So their way of getting back at him for his inappropriate social conduct was to send him to the Dakotas to be annihilated.
And that's certainly what happened.
Thank you for such a wonderful talk and making me feel more understanding of Texas, how you write and talk. But I also want you to talk about the confrontation that we have with these leaders, and as you point out, the disguising of the full complexity as we approach 2026 and the 250th. So you're known as a founding fathers scholar, and what can you prognosticate for that confrontation in the next few years?
Well, it's hard to say because we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we really don't know what's going to happen in the next year, right? I mean, we had one outcome. It would have been a different story with a different electoral outcome. And right now, to me, it's kind of in limbo because we don't know how much the administration is going to be involved in this, and I'm sure they will want to be involved in it. So we'll have to see. There are a number of organizations, many organizations who are already getting ready for that. I imagine that it will be different from 1976, the bicentennial, which was kind of controversial. There was controversy there too, but I remember it as a kid. I just remember the bicentennial minute, and it seemed like a more celebratory thing. I have a feeling it's going to be different this time, but what the hell is going to happen in the next year? What's going to happen next week? I mean, it's just, there's so many things so many ways that this could go. And we have plans about what to do, but you don't know how you're going to be able to do them. What kind of pushback you're going to get, who's going to want to tell a story a particular kind of way. So we're just at a weird moment. But I do know at Massachusetts Historical Society, Monticello, Library of Congress, all those places are preparing to do something, but we've got to see what's going to happen. Because this is just a very weird time.
got one over here, and then I'm coming to you.
I will be brief. My family has been in Montgomery County since at least 1837. I myself grew up in Cut and Shoot, Texas. Somehow I got to UT undergrad and UT law, and I do civil rights litigation, particularly in East Texas. I'm wondering if, I'm sure you know this, but I'm still wondering if you know about the incident on the courthouse square in Montgomery County in 1931.
Where the person was burned alive?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. My father was there and saw that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mentioned that in the book. It's something to try to talk about, because I grew up in Conroe, and 7 miles from Cut and Shoot, and my grandparents lived in Livingston, so we would every weekend drive from Conroe through Cut and Shoot to get to Livingston,
Right.
Texas. It's a hard place.
Yes.
The burning up. I mean, this is medieval. Burning somebody alive on the courthouse square, and that memory of that. I had family members who would never stay in Conroe. They wouldn't spend the night in Conroe because they said, it was just too much. And so this is not ancient history. I mean, in terms of history, this is a blink of an eye. And some of the people who were participating in that and all of that, I mean, they were alive. You mentioned your father saw this. I mean, these things shape us, and they create a memory. The memory is there, and the reverberations from it are there. And it's always been a tough town. And so, I mean, I was surprised, that there have been some changes there, but it's, the Klan, it was the center of the Klan has been there as well. The Bob White case of the guy who was shot, I talk about this in the book, who was shot in the courthouse, in the courtroom. Everybody saw it, and the guy was acquitted. A black man who was accused of raping a white woman. And my grandparents knew these people and said that they were going together. That's the phrase that they used. They were going together, and the husband found out about it and, said that this was rape. And he was tried, in Livingston, and then they moved it to Conroe for a change of venue. And when he was there, the woman's husband came up to the table and shot the guy. And everybody saw it, the judge, everyone, and the person was acquitted. And so for things like that, burning on the courthouse square, Bob White, that I write about it in the book, and my grandfather used to tell me about this, and I never paid very much attention to it, just another atrocity that he mentioned. But that shapes a town.
I was told that several of the leaders that instigated that incident were leading citizens in the town, newspaper editor, people like that. And my father told me that he said, in those days, produce came to the grocery store in wooden boxes, and that the people that wanted to carry this out went to the grocery stores to get the wooden boxes to use for the fire. Anyway, that's enough of that. Thank you for taking my question.
I mean, you have to remember those kinds of things, because that was not that long ago, and the courthouse square is there. I used to work at that courthouse between college and going to law school, and just walking in there, and the memory of that is, the stories about that live with you. We shouldn't forget it.
Where I grew up on Farm Road 1484 out at Cut and Shoot. I could stand in my front yard and throw a football and hit the house of the national president of the Klan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon Reed. Excellent presentation, excellent book. Sam Collins from Galveston. One of the things I want to ask is how can we bridge the gap between the academic arena and the activists on the ground, subject matter experts in the community that don't necessarily have the academic training, but they've studied the material. People like the late Reginald Moore from Sugarland that helped to discover the Sugarland 95. The stress of the work, I believe, led to its early demise. But also in commentary about Galveston and Juneteenth, we have newspaper reports from primary sources in 1865 that state that Galveston was occupied by Negro troops. This has been left out of the narrative of these stories, and that there were 8,000 to 10,000 soldiers in Galveston, but all they report on is the 2,000 with Gordon Granger. And to answer some of the questions about these emancipation days, I think we use Juneteenth as a platform to talk about all of them.
Yeah.
Kentucky was August 8th. Oklahoma was June 14th, 1866, with the signing of 5 treaties with what they call the civilized nations. So there were many, as you talked about, emancipation days even after Juneteenth. But the community members and activists that are working sometimes have trouble reaching the professors and the academic arena, and they're not seen as knowledgeable because they don't have the titles or degrees. But like I said, people like Mr. Moore was one of these community activists that had shared the information and was proven right, like yourself, once the bodies were discovered at the high school. So any suggestions for individuals working in the community that are not in the academic arena?
Well,
and also advice to the educators to not discount the information coming from the grassroots groups that have worked for many years to shed light on this information.
well, just on your point about Juneteenth and the multiple emancipation days, I think you're exactly right, and I've said that. Juneteenth should be like an umbrella, an opportunity to talk about all the other ones. It shouldn't just be Juneteenth. It should be all of them are mentioned, and that's an occasion to do that. The way that I've seen it work with community people is more through public history, museums like this, other places, historical societies. That's where I have met people, members of the communities, who have information. Certainly Monticello they have a project called Getting Word, where they have interviewed the descendants of all of, whoever they can find them, of people who were enslaved at Monticello, and their work forms, they haven't had any problem at all using their information as part of the history of Monticello, as part of the history of Monticello. I think either contacting people directly, but as I said, I've seen it much more through public history, through museums, historical societies, where people in the community who have information work with museum officials and also historians. That's where you typically see them, because we're off in our office doing stuff. But when you get together for exhibits and things like that, that's a way of doing it. But I guess the main thing is contacting people. And I would say, certainly in the area of history and slavery, since we understand that enslaved people, for the most part, did not have the capacity, were not allowed to keep records of their lives. I think and you agree with this, that when we're writing about slavery, there's a much wider, the net is cast much wider for the kinds of information that can be used. But there's no question that we should be using that as a resource. People in the community, families who have stories, should be a part of the creation of the historical record as well. So, but I understand what you're saying. There are a lot of people who discount that. Genealogists and people like that are very often, some people look down upon them, but I don't think I think that's changing now, because people understand if you're going to write about slavery, if you're going to pull this record together, it can't just be letters. It can't just be the letters of white slave owners. It has to be as many different sources as possible. So I never discount that, and my work relies on both the archive, the written archive, but also involves oral history that is corroborated, and oral history through actions and through other means. It's an integral part of what it is that I do, and I think all historians, you get the information from where you can. The question is reliability. Even things that are written, people lie in letters. So everything has to be checked, and you can't just look down on a source because of where it comes from, saying, oh, it's not from the right place. It's really what the person is saying and what information there is to back up what they're saying.
Michael, did you have a question?
It's the woman in the white.
Did you? There was somebody. Okay.
I've heard you in other lectures talk about the children of Thomas Jefferson, and that about half of them stayed in Charlotte or Charlottesville, another half went up north, and the ones that stayed in Charlotte identified as being black, and the ones up north as white and changed their name, didn't use Jefferson. And I was you were going to, check into more of that story, and I was wondering if you had, because it's almost like you could do a twin study, except they're not twins, but they all come from the same family and have the same parents. And some stay where known in the South, and others start a new life with a new name. I think you said Wisconsin. I mean, kind of like almost up to Canada.
Actually, as a matter of fact, I'm working on a book now, the second volume of the Hemings family story, and I'm doing just that. I'm writing about the Eston line. Madison and Eston were the two youngest children who started out in the black community, and they moved to Chillicothe, Ohio. And then when Ohio starts really getting bad for black people, Eston decides that he's going to move to Wisconsin. So he moves up to Wisconsin, and he changes his name to Eston Hemings Jefferson, E.H. Jefferson, and changes his racial designation. In the one census, he and his wife and children are Negro or black, and then when they go up to Wisconsin, they're white. So I'm following that line and the Madison line. Madison Hemings, the one who gave the recollections, stayed in the black community. And so you can kind of see the difference in their lives based upon these people. They're from the same place. They're the same folks. But some identify as black, continue to identify as black, and others are white, and you can see the difference in their lives based on it. The two eldest children, a son and a daughter, left Monticello to live as white people, and we don't know. They changed their names. There's no real way to trace them. We've tried to do that, and other people as well. I mean, I think there's some hope that maybe DNA might be able, with the sort of general databases that they have, might be able to pull this together at some point. And there are probably people who have no idea that, who they are. It's not like they're hiding anything. They just don't know. Eston's line, after he changes his racial designation, his children are start out as Negroes, or but by the next generation, they tell different stories to their children, and they didn't know that they were descended from these people because they'd lost the story, because they had to lose not Jefferson, they had to lose Sally Hemings too, because if they kept her, that would mean they were part black. and they were not. They were white people. So there are people who are descendants probably of the two older children who have no idea that they are connected to them. So I'm working on that book now. So. Yeah. She asked how I feel about the way Monticello is handling the Hemings story now. I think they're doing a good job with it. The room is, I think, supposed to be a representation of that. I mean, his grandson said that that was where she lived, and I don't trust his grandson. I mean, that's, I have a whole chapter in my first book about how he was the one who said, well, the reason these children look just like Jefferson is because they're the children of his nephew. I mean, he says a lot of stuff in that letter that are just things that are just not true. And so I don't know why we would take his word about that. I mean, it could be, but, and that's just my prejudice. Maybe I have to get over that. But the projections, that's the best they can do. Because they have a room where that's supposed to be the Sally Hemings room, and they have projections of her, combing Harriet's hair and tending to her children and so forth. Because we have no images of Sally Hemings, and so they're trying to make her live, to come alive in some sort of way. But I guess they figured that's the best that they could do. I mean, compared to 1994 when I went there, before my book came out, and I did the tour, and she wasn't mentioned at all. And if she was mentioned, it was, that's not true, that never happened, and blah, blah, blah. It's a sea change, but, they're doing the best they can.
I think we have one more question, if that's all right.
Sure.
So there's a community in Coahuila, the Mexican state of Coahuila, Renacimiento, that you probably know about, where they celebrate Juneteenth and have for many years. I wonder what your thoughts are on how we can move beyond the binary of Juneteenth and slavery as a black and white phenomenon. How do Mexicans talk about that? How can we engage this conversation in a way that might make sense in a much more inclusive way?
Well, to talk about the history of Mexico and slavery and the complexity of it. You probably know more about this than I do. I mean, I'm limited to knowing that Mexico was anti-slavery, outlawed slavery. I do know that African American people escaped south. Instead of following the North Star, it made sense to go south. And there is a black presence throughout Mexico that extends. I start talking in the first chapter of the book about the 1520s, when there are African people who come with the Spanish and then leave some of the expeditions and go down into Mexico. So I think talking about this not just as plantation slavery or just about, the 1820s and 1830s, that this is something that starts in the 1500s with the part of the Spanish Empire, and saying that it's global and it's ancient. It isn't just a short period of time. So I think in addition to talking about the conflict between the Mexicans and the Texians, to talk about the history from the very beginning, as far back as you can go, would be a way of approaching it. And I think it's a way of, smoothing out complicating the binary. And it's not just one thing, or even indigenous people and the institution of slavery. among blacks. So it's not just a black and white thing. I mean, that's the point that I stress in the book as well. Texas has always been you know, a diverse place from the very beginning. It didn't have to become diverse. It started out that way. And if you approach it from all of the people who are here, all of the people who are interacting with one another, people from Mexico, Spanish people, indigenous people, people of African descent, European Americans, to show the fullness, the richness of all of that, I think that that's a way to move beyond the binaries, because it's definitely not a binary story. Thank you very much. Oh, did you have a question?
No, is it on? I wanted to thank you so very, very much for being a part of this symposium and giving this wonderful keynote address and answering the questions. It means a lot. And when you say it, we hear it, and we thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.